Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. Wanted to go over this idea of politicians and the elites basically lying to us constantly by always spinning the truth to try to hide reality and to steer us in the direction in which they want us to go. And we see that happening all around us today in 2021. But if we actually study history, we see that it's the same playbook that they've used decade after decade after decade, century after century after century. As an example, I want to go back in time, as my good buddy Simon Black says, to Weimar Germany, hyperinflation, something we study on this channel all the time to educate ourselves to how these things work so we can predict the probability of this happening in the future or not happening in the future. So let's touch on an article, or first go to an article from Business Insider. And this is talking about Weimar Germany. They go into a deep dive and they bring up a gentleman who was the richest and most powerful industrialist in Germany at the time in the early 1920s. His name, Hugo Steins. Now, Hugo Steins famously or infamously got rich. How? By taking out huge, huge amounts of debt in the late 19 or 19 teens, I guess. Around that time, about 1918, 1919, probably prior, right around World War I and after. And then what happened as inflation really started to pick up, and then it just went parabolic in 1923. He got rich. Why? Because he was paying back the debt with devalued marks. So his revenue, his cash flow was increasing in nominal terms, but yet his debt payment stayed the same. So basically, he was able to pay off his debt with currency units that were effectively worthless. So he got everything he borrowed to buy, he ended up getting 2 years, 3 years, 4 years for free without really having to pay it back. That was the transfer of wealth from the lender to the borrower. In this case, the bank to Mr. Hugo Stein. So he got fabulously rich through inflation. So it talks about the spin he was putting on inflation back in 1921 and 1922. Because, of course, Mr. Steins was arguing as to why inflation was a good thing and that we needed, more inflation. Because although it might not be great, the alternative is far worse. What would the alternative be? If they stopped the money printing, if they increased interest rates, but then unemployment would go up. And he said, inflation is just the price we have to pay for full employment. And if we reduce the rate of inflation, well, that's going to hurt the poor and the middle class because there will be fewer jobs available. I mean, for you guys watching this video right now, that sounds insane. But it's the exact same thing the elites, the politicians, or their puppets, the useful idiots, are saying today about the inflation and the supply shortages and the supply chain disruptions that we are seeing right now in the United States. So let's first read this article, or just this quote from Mr. Steins, and then move over to what the reincarnation of Mr. Stein's idea is saying today on Twitter. Hugo Steins himself, the richest and most powerful industrialist in Germany, whose empire of over 1/6 of the country's industry had been largely built on advantages, foundation of an inflationary economy, paraded a social conscience shamelessly. He justified inflation as the means of guaranteeing full employment, not as something desirable, but simply as the only course open to a benevolent government. This goes back to exactly what I was saying before. His argument, essentially, is although inflation isn't great, it's better than the alternative because the alternative is higher rates of unemployment, which would be even worse for the poor and middle class. Of course, we know that he was on the wrong side of history as far as his prediction, because in 1923, the hyperinflation not only wiped out, well, I was going to say it wiped out the rich, but it didn't wipe out all the rich. It was dependent upon how much debt you had. Because if you had a lot of debt, it didn't wipe you out, it made you rich. But it, let's say, wiped out not just the poor and middle class, but 95% of the entire population. And then I would also argue that it made the rich poorer in real terms as well, because they had access to fewer goods and services. And at the end of the day, that is true wealth. But now let's fast forward to what they're saying today. I'm going to go to Twitter. And this, believe it or not, is a Harvard economist. His name is Jason Furman. Let me see if I can increase the size. Here we go. So Jason Furman was part of the Obama administration. And of course, he's a very well-respected economist. I mean, straight from Harvard. Doesn't get any better than that, right? He says most of the economic problems we are facing, inflation, supply chains, etc., are high-class problems. We shouldn't have had them, or we wouldn't have had them if unemployment rate was still 10%. We would instead have had a much worse problem. So you see what he's saying? Is that, yes, inflation, it might be bad, but this, it's just the rich people that have to worry about that. At the end of the day, it's a lot better than having higher rates of unemployment, because that would be much worse for the poor and middle class. Literally, exactly what Hugo Steins was saying in 1921 and 1922. Same BS, just a different day. So what's my point? My point is you got to study history. Whether it's about hyperinflation, whether it's about understanding the true motives of politicians, the global elite, understanding how they spin the truth and reality to try to manipulate you and influence you to do their bidding. You've got to be cognizant of this. And the only way to truly get your head around what we may see in the future is to look back at the past. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Make sure you're always standing up and fighting for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. See you in the next video.